Welcome to our second panel on animals. This one is technically titled Animal Histories, but it seems that it might also be Animal Anthropologies. So I'm very excited to introduce people today, but actually I'm going first. So I'll introduce myself and then I'll introduce people before they speak so that I just have a little note about one project of every person so that if you're interested in their work, you might go search for that in the future. All right. So my name is Kirsten Mallon Andrews. I am a PhD candidate and teaching associate at UC Irvine in anthropology. One quick publication of mine is an article called Catching Air, Risk and Embodied Ocean Health Among Dominican Diver Fishermen. And that's in Medical Anthropology Quarterly, if you're interested. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Would someone be willing to time me and just let me know when I have a few minutes left? Okay, can you all see that? Okay, so today I will be talking about mistrust in multi-species methods. Hang on one second. Let me try and change this a little bit. There we go. There we go. Okay. So floating alone where the reef bank dropped off into a deep opening into the Atlantic, I sensed something at my back. I'd been trying to follow spear fishermen while also spear fishing, and I wasn't doing either one very well. Imitating my interlocutors, I had been trying to casually outwit a snapper, trying to anticipate where in the underwater labyrinth it would appear next. I hid between crevices in the reef structure so that it wouldn't see me until it was too late, so that I could have that fraction of a second opportunity to spear the fish. It was, in essence, a high-stakes hide and seek conducted on a breath hold, and one that I was losing with this fish, who seemed to have encountered better diver fishermen before. The rest of the fishermen had swum on, and the snapper had lost me on the edges of the reef. Maybe it was the sensation of being watched or a slight twitch in the movements of the smaller fish below me, but I knew before I turned around that there was a barracuda watching my back. She was smaller, 8 to 9 pounds, and I watched her eyes dart from the snapper on the end of my catch line, which is a metal string with my fish on it that I dragged behind me as I swam. The barracuda waited mistrustfully at a distance for the expected interaction. I was supposed to take the small fish off my catch line, throw it over the water so that it fell between us, and as the barracuda attempted to snatch the fish out of the water, I was supposed to take a shot. I looked at the fish on my stringer, trying to decide if it was small enough to sacrifice for a shot in which I had little confidence. I lifted my spear gun and the barracuda faded effortlessly into the yellow haze of the surface. So I've spent the past 6 years doing ethnographic research, which included diving and spearfishing with fishermen in Montecristi. My original research was on the relationship between human and environmental health. But as I saw the central role that fish played in the lives of fishermen, not only as prey, but as individuals, this kind of pushed me towards expanding my consideration of ethnographic subjects to include fish as well. But how do you conduct research with beings that are deeply mistrustful of you, and for very good reason? So as I show in this talk, this was a question I originally asked myself about fish, but which turned out to be relevant in relation to humans as well. Along the coast of Montecristi, the spear fishermen I worked with instructed me repeatedly. Barracuda sense your intentions, they explained. You can't think too hard about spearing them or else they'll swim away. Encounters with fellow predators like barracuda in the water were this delicate dance of mistrust. Divers often talked about the region's most tigre barracuda, the individuals that had evaded spear guns for years while snatching fish off divers' catch lines. In contrast to the tigre barracuda who visited the region from open ocean were considered naive, and they were easily recognized based on their behavior in relation to divers, aka easy to catch. So in this presentation, I consider relations between fish, fishermen, and myself as a part of what I refer to as ecologies of mistrust. This is, of course, a work in progress, so I don't have a fully fleshed out theory that I could lay out for you here. But what I will do is discuss two kind of snapshots of this ecology of mistrust. The first one is in the relations between fish and Dominican fishermen. And then the second one is in relations between myself and the community in which I conducted ethnography. So thinking about multi-species relations within deep ecologies of mistrust, I argue, makes visible these longer histories of interventions in the Caribbean alongside more recent environmental changes in the Caribbean and elsewhere. So what I aim to show here is that mistrust in multi-species relations is not simply cultural in the case of humans, nor just instinctive in the case of fish. It is also practical, ecological, political, and historical. So I'll start by talking a little bit about mistrust between fish and fishermen. Fish relations play a central role for Dominicans in coastal communities, and they often dictate how fishermen relate to their marine environments, as well as to one another. An angry colleague would be described as having the face of a sea bass, or la cara de robalo, and the local white ethnographer, yours truly, was often called barracuda for her elongated nose. Fishermen often talk about changing marine ecologies in relation to the kinds of fish that can no longer survive in heavily polluted and sediment saturated waters near shore. And as fish populations declined as a result of these broader ecological conditions, fishermen were left attempting to outwit the few fish that remained, individuals with long histories of tigreaje in relation to divers. So there was, for example, the barracuda of Tururuque, who for years had stolen fish off divers' catch lines. There was also an elusive black snapper along the Cordillera, who fishermen had been trying to catch for years, catching only glimpses instead. So as the nearshore seascapes, such as that of Montecristi, are undeniably changing, and this is a result of agro-industrial river runoff, warming ocean temperatures, and increasing storm frequency, as you can see here. This is a storm surge coming up against the Malecón. There has also been a US and European driven push for new conservation regulation in the Caribbean. But from the perspective of many conservation officials, the most pressing cause of depleted ocean environments are fishermen. As a wave of new conservation laws and regulations flooded the Dominican Republic, fishermen found that many of their regular and locally consumed species to now be off limits and illegal to catch. So when the normally skittish parrotfish realized they were now legally protected, fishermen got back into their boats on many days, complaining that the parrotfish were sticking their tongues out at them, gloating in their protected status. So parrotfish, in this sense, joined a category of fish that systematically outwitted fishermen or avoided them. And fishermen concluded that fish such as parrotfish in this instance knew how to read and write, which is an unfair advantage in this community of mostly semi-literate fishermen. Tigreaje was also an important mode of relations between fishermen and fish, and one that played with mistrust in different ways. So Felix, one of Montecristi's longtime divers, walked out of the water one day vowing to catch a particular yellowtail snapper that had been eluding him all week. Ese es un tigre, pero yo soy más tigre. He described how he was going to set a trap, tying a baited hook and a line to rock outside the snapper's home. The bait would be a piece of parrotfish, Felix explained, but it would have to be already scaled because they're picky eaters. Outwitting especially tigre fish was a tactic that drew from years of experience with mistrustful interactions. A grouper could never chase me down on land, Luis explained once when I had failed to do just that. So how could I chase him down in his waters? Instead, Luis pretends not to see the fish as he passes by them, only to circle back clandestinely, surprising them from an unexpected angle. Knowing where fish lived, how they acted, what they liked to eat, and how to prepare it, as well as anticipating their curiosity, were all skills learned through what I concluded was participant observation. So the best fisherman was also the best ethnographer of fish. So now I'm going to switch a little bit to talk about mistrust between myself and the community in which I conducted research. I began this research with a small crew of diver fishermen, but as I started to expand my presence in the community, wanting to know more about all the scales of the fishing industry, I came across some obstacles. To my initial horror, as I began spending more time at the wharf and fishing shops, rumors that I worked for the CIA spread among this notoriously mistrustful community. Before I say any more, I do want to point out that fishermen have very good reason to be mistrustful of any outsider. Montecristi is a historical site of smuggling and a current site of smuggling. It was invaded by US troops, and as the state kind of buys into conservation incentives, much of their catch, as I mentioned before, has become illegal. So my main interlocutor confronted me about these rumors, asking point blank if they were true, to my horror. He reminded me of his stakes and my intentions, since he was the one that had introduced me to much of the fishing community. For the record, I do not work for the CIA. And despite my initial panic about this situation, it became this important point of reflection on the unequal nature of relationships between researcher and researched. I interpret it as I was asking fishermen to provide time and information about their lives for the benefit of my study, but what I offered in return were these kinds of hazy promises of potential benefits that probably would not directly affect them in ways that were meaningful on their terms. So I came to understand these rumors and many others as exercises of power amidst fundamentally unequal relationships. Mistrust, leveraged through rumors, called my motives for research into question, but they also stirred community suspicions that could have restricted my access to fishermen, something they knew was crucial for my study. The rumors also located my presence in a history of colonial relations in the Dominican Republic, where political meddling, resource extraction, and the operationalization of bodies is unfortunately the norm. My rapport with fishermen was cultivated very slowly and very carefully on land as I invested time with them and their families. But I found that one of the few ways that I could really overcome this mistrust was to learn to spearfish. My willingness and ability to spearfish alongside fishermen kind of set me apart from the biologists and conservationists who also came to Montecristi to do research. These researchers would normally gather fishermen, give a charla about sustainable fishing practices, and then return to Santo Domingo. Or those who came to survey ocean ecologies employed the town's ecotourism company to take them out to the reef banks where they counted urchins, sharks, or parrotfish. So when a conservation NGO once presented their findings about the scant number of fish at one offshore reef, fishermen questioned their methods. Of course they didn't see any fish, Luis reasoned. If they wanted to see fish, they should have asked us to teach them to spearfish. So in fact, as I was learning to spearfish, Luis would point to snapper or octopus that I could only see once they were on the end of a spear. So by learning to fish alongside these men, I had demonstrated a kind of investment in their lives, which was a gesture that was glaringly absent from many of their interactions with conservationists. So just to add a few concluding thoughts before I pass the baton, what I'm really getting at here is what we can see through these ecologies of mistrust that saturate both human and more than human worlds. So from my perspective, ecologies of mistrust reveal relations between humans and animals in the Dominican Republic that are deeply impacted by changing environments as they have been historically, which we saw a little bit in the last panel. And they also reveal these inherent inequalities in research relationships that have been largely shaped by histories of imperialism and intervention. And at the same time, a really important point of this is that these ecologies of mistrust that fish are individuals. They're often talked about in terms of sustainability and in numbers, but the way that conservation engages with fish doesn't necessarily take into account their life experiences or the context of mistrust that link them to these broader political and historical seascapes. So I'll end there. Thank you very much. And then I'm going to pass it along to Robin. So Robin, or Lauren Derby, is an associate professor of history at UCLA. Her forthcoming book is titled Werewolves and Other Bêtes Noires: Sorcery as History in the Haitian Dominican Borderlands.
Thank you to all the panelists who joined, who formed part of this little community around Dominican animals. And also I want to thank the DSI for this conference and also for taking a risk with all these animals. So my paper is called Preternaturalia, of Talking Cows and Other Bêtes Infernales. This paper explores narratives of encounter with, oh, and I should say this is based on fieldwork I've been doing and oral histories about encounters with Bacá in Elias Pina in the town of Banica over the course of the last decade. This paper explores narratives of encounter with a particularly feared genre of shapeshifting phenomena called Bacá, spirit beings which are deployed to steal or protect farm animals, harvests, and cash in Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Bacá are spirit demons created by sorcerers which present as dogs, pigs, horses, and cattle and help amass wealth. Butchers told me about sheep that meowed, goats with pigs' tails, and bulls that cried like a baby, creatures which were really Bacá or spirit animals. They are pigs sold at market with human fingernails, or cows that talk or cry, and they most often present as dogs, pigs, or cattle. I heard haunting stories about invisible visitations and how they were eradicated, struggles in the bush by virile men who fought off these beasts, ranchers and butchers' tales about Bacás that eviscerated their herds and drained their cash, workers that resisted cruel employers by secretly stealing their crops via Bacá, just as heroic men protect their families and the nation from feral packs of Bacá streaming over the border from Haiti. As a spirit demon in animal form, the Bacá conjoins the specter of mass death brought on by colonialism in the Caribbean with the animals that enabled the subjugation of first Taino and then African slaves, and later went on to provide sustenance for freedmen on the island. These narratives raise many questions, but the first conundrum is why the Bacá almost invariably appears as the seed animals brought to Hispaniola by Columbus, the feral dogs, cattle, and pigs, which were the first line of attack during the conquest and which are now extinct. Witchcraft studies have not considered the significance of the demonic host on the grounds that in the Anglo-American model, whether the beast was an ass, ox, ram, or horse, it was a manifestation of the singular embodiment of evil. But the semantics of animals in Bacá apparitions are not arbitrary or contingent. I want to make the case that these narratives can be a source for what historian Ranajit Guha has termed the small voices of history, but this requires taking stock of the historical animal traces in these accounts. This study considers these animal hosts as repositories of popular memory, deriving from a long history of multi-species entanglements on Hispaniola that carry sensory, aesthetic, and ontological meanings. The many meanings of non-human animals in this case is more than just symbolic. They've long played leading roles as technologies of domination and terror, material subsistence, codependent laboring partners, sacrificial beasts, companion animals, as well as the inspiration for animal metaphors, uses identity assertions and mimetic alter egos in pseudonyms, fables, nicknames, jokes, storytelling, carnival masquerade, and even providing a language of ludic sexual innuendo in everyday speech. The particular animals invoked in these narratives have ritual value because of the acute emotive resonance they invoke, whether despised as vicious attack dogs that hunted slaves, or beloved through enabling the privilege of autonomy at a time when slavery was the rule for people of color. If the animal long served as other in Europe, this was not the case within slave contexts, in which slaves were classed with and often lived and worked intimately with farm animals in a context in which they likely provided a modicum of solace under brutal conditions, or in post-emancipation societies in which subsistence peasants unattached to plantations could be demeaned as just as lowly as free-range pigs. Yet these phantasmic sightings also indicate an element of African American trickster heroism's defiant refusal to mourn, as popular storytelling and playful speech acts in the idiom of the carnivalesque refuse the elegiac and instead insist on jouissance and empowerment in the face of harsh challenges. I wish to argue that Bêtes stories are cultural performances of haunted landscapes where assemblages of the dead gather together with the living. They thus convey the experience of being haunted and hunted by predatory spirits in animal form that can conjure the experience of terror wrought by animals that enabled colonial conquest and beyond in conditions of domination and precarity. These emotionally dense animals serve as charged mnemonics, which are apprehended somatically in tales of everyday furtive encounters with frightening beastly demons, as well as more playful forms such as roasting and eating them in patron saint festivals, masquerading as them in carnival, and joking about them as sex objects in carnal humor. These Bêtes stories reveal that the trauma of conquest lives on unresolved within implicit social knowledge, as these apparitions of spectral animal demons force a never-ending revisiting of the animal terror that created the lingering trouble in the first place. The visceral dread evoked by these animal demons, I propose, are a material manifestation of what Dominicans call the curse or fuku of Colon, a popular taboo surrounding even uttering the name of Columbus due to the scourge he unleashed. Christina Sharp has written eloquently about how living in the wake means grounding the history and present of terror as the core of Black existence. These Bêtes apparitions must thus be seen as acts of witnessing and mourning with several layered meanings. First, in response to the horror of mass death of Amerindians and slaves, later becoming extinction narratives mourning of feral animal commons that long sustained these freedmen outside of slavery. If at times traumatic events are silenced as the result of a taboo, by contrast, Bêtes sightings seem to obsessively revisit the violence wrought by conquest, as these cursed animals shadow, hunt, and terrorize contemporary residents of the island. Looming far larger than all the other quadrupeds on the island when they first arrived, these beasts were agents of terror, a fact which the conquistadores deployed to their advantage, making the horse and the dog especially central players in the domination of the Taino indigenous population. Contemporaries noted the look of astonishment on the part of the Amerindians when the horses first arrived, and later, in an effort to render these quadrupeds even more frightening, the Spanish laced strings of bells across their mounts in battle so as to augment their otherworldly aura. But surely it was the fact that the indigenous were hunted and lanced en masse with dogs from atop these martial steeds that rendered them terrifying as horses, men, and canines worked together in lethal squads. There are reports that the horse and rider in their military garb were perceived as monstrous centaurs by the indigenes, and the Spanish sought to augment these terrifying rumors of their own supernatural immortality by carefully hiding horse corpses when they died. Indeed, it's significant that the first indigenous image painted after the arrival of the Spanish did not represent the powerful technology they brought with them, the battleships and guns. Rather, it sketched the terrifying sight of a man on horseback. Over time, the new sights, sounds, and smells came to convey the horror of these animals, forming a sensory memory in which these beastly traces conjured up a visceral reaction of dread. Dogs were trained as attack animals to hunt escaped Indians and Africans, disembowel their victims, and were fed their flesh as a reward. As Bartolomé de las Casas' haunting images graphically remind us, indigenous body parts were even sold as dog food in markets, since they were seen, after all, as non-human. Indeed, it was on Hispaniola that barking at fugitive Indians paralyzed with fear came to be called dogging, as sicking attack canines on Amerindians became a verb. In addition to the new smells of gunshot, the soundscape of the enormous beasts snorting, barking, snarling, braying, and stampeding must have been particularly frightening, given the silence of the previous landscape of softly shifting hutias and silent lizards, a land where even the dogs didn't bark. Since the Taino also hunted at night, surely colliding with these feral boars, the fact that pigs as nocturnal predators must also have contributed to their image as a harbinger of death, as did their capacity for violence, which was only comparable to the wild dogs. This history helps explain later uses of these animal icons as signs of power within Haitian and Dominican voodoo, such as the use of a horse tail as a power object, a zombie which appears in the form of a steer, a dog skull used as a wanga, or a fetish used to protect from jackals called a chien de buisson, or the fact that the horse rider semis began to appear in caves where indigenous peoples took refuge, hid their ritual paraphernalia, and died as subalterns sought to acquire some of the Iberians' ferocious might. This history helps explain why the dog and the horse served as the primordial gateways to the spirit world. Sketching the contours of a longue durée culture of multi-species engagement and animal codependence, I suggest helps explain the extraordinary prominence of pigs, cattle, and goats in Dominican and Haitian popular culture, from tall tales to shape-shifting beliefs. This form of historical excavation is also an act of witnessing, since the feral ecoscape of Hispaniola is now all but lost, since the hutia, manatee, and wild cattle were promiscuously slaughtered, and the last Creole jabali boars were eviscerated in the swine flu eradication program in 1979. We cannot bring back the once teeming ecosystem of Hispaniola, but we can reconstruct its contours through historical research, since, as Van Doren and Rose have said, storytelling is one of the great arts of witness. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robin. That was fascinating. So we're going to move on now to Elizabeth Gansen, who is an assistant professor of Spanish at Grand Valley State University, Michigan. She is currently working on a book titled Natural Designs, The Construction of the New World in Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo's Sumario and the Historia General y Natural de las Indias. So if you could unmute, I'll hand over the mic.
Mine is pre-recorded.
Okay, how do we access that? Our very helpful tech people. Okay.
Hi, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Gansen, and my talk today is entitled Cows in the Water, Fish on Land, a Crisis of Representation in Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo's Historia. Thanks for watching. As the Spanish historian Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo busily worked away at writing his New World Natural History, he was only too aware of the limitations on his task. The publications that emerged from these efforts, the Sumario de la Natural Historia de las Indias, published in 1526, and the first edition of the first part of the Historia General y Natural de las Indias, published 9 years later in 1535, are the first systematic inquiries of the flora and fauna of the Antilles and mainland Central America. Oviedo confronted a host of challenges in his attempts to document and describe the innumerable species of these vast territories. The most pervasive of these problems speaks to the very reason Oviedo seeks to write a natural history in the first place, to make understood the novelties he encounters. Often, Oviedo compensates for readers' lack of knowledge of American plants and animals by drawing partial analogies to the appearance, taste, and smell of similar phenomena in Europe. In this way, the Spanish historian seeks to make known the unknown and familiar what is entirely foreign. Yet, there are times when these comparisons do not come easily. Above all, his encounters with the iguana and the manatee put on display some of the difficulties of Oviedo's efforts to describe and classify these creatures, as well as the visual strategies he evokes to compensate for these knowledge gaps. These crises of representation lay bare the fundamental dilemmas at the heart of Oviedo's attempts to capture this new reality. Beloved by Spaniards and indigenous alike as an exquisite ailment, nevertheless, the iguana's identity remains elusive for Oviedo. And here I have a picture of a modern day iguana, just to give a sense of the kind of creature Oviedo would have encountered. It might not be exactly the same, but it is an iguana. It is so frightful to behold, according to the Spanish historian, that Oviedo maintains it would take great courage to stand one's ground upon encountering it for the first time, and anyone ignorant of its true nature would have to be entirely out of their mind to try its flesh. Its sharp teeth and fangs, the spiny protuberances that line its backbone, and its bird-like claws are all cause for alarm among those unaware of its docility and pleasant taste. Compounding Oviedo's difficulties in describing it is the fact that the lizard seems equally at home in the water as on land, leaving him at a loss to determine if it is an animal or fish. Moreover, Oviedo also takes issue with prior attempts to classify the iguana by the royal chronicler Pietro Martir de Angleria. Oviedo's account of the iguana in the Historia represents his most vigorous defense of the authority of the eyewitness to the wonders of the New World, as well as his most acute struggles to resolve problems unanticipated by his classical predecessors. It is no secret that for Oviedo, Pietro Martires de Orbe Novo, on the New World, epitomizes the pitfalls of the so-called armchair historian, he whose only knowledge of the Indies is acquired in relative comfort from others who have made the difficult journey. In a number of occasions in the Historia, Oviedo criticizes the errors committed by the Italian humanist, ranging from cases of mistaken identity to islands and trees that simply do not exist. Oviedo claims to find similar inaccuracies in Martir's description of the iguana, albeit he treats them much more severely than in these other instances. The crux of Oviedo's rhetorical tack is the fact that, quote, Pedro Martir says that these iguanas are similar to the crocodile, which are animals from the Nile River. He dedicates roughly half the chapter on the iguana to defending his position on the matter, employing Pliny the Elder and Saint Isidore of Seville to demonstrate the innumerable differences between the crocodile, which Oviedo had never seen, and the iguana, which he had. Oviedo excuses his lengthy comparison between the two animals as an effort to correct the errors in Martir's account. Quote, and if I have dragged this out so much, it has been to banish Pedro Martir's opinion from readers. In his haste to expose the Italian humanist ignorance, however, Oviedo overlooks the commonalities in their stance toward the iguana. Although Martir does observe certain resemblances between this lizard and the crocodile, he also notes an important difference. Quote, Columbus and his men affirm that iguanas do not differ in the least bit from the Egyptian crocodile, except in their size, since Pliny says that some crocodiles were found that were 18 cubits, but the largest of these serpents are 8 feet. In the Historia, Oviedo provides roughly similar numbers, maintaining that on average the iguana measures 4 feet, whereas Isidore states the crocodile is 20 cubits long, or 35 feet, and Pliny the Elder 18 cubits, or 31.5 feet. Yet Oviedo does not acknowledge that the Italian humanist too defends the same argument. Quite to the contrary, the size discrepancy between the crocodile and the iguana is evidence Oviedo presents to challenge Martir's claims. Quote, Martir is much deceived, Oviedo writes, and those who write of these things from hearsay are obligated to commit similar and notorious errors, because these iguanas are not any larger than what I have said. Oviedo casts his predecessor's account as erroneous because of the relative size difference between the iguana and the Egyptian crocodile, ignoring that Martyr does indeed clarify this same point. In engaging in such a selective reading of Martyr's comments regarding this lizard, Oviedo seeks to demonstrate the dangers of writing without firsthand experience. Moreover, in taking a stand against Martyr's treatment of the iguana, Oviedo discounts any possibility of understanding this creature through a comparative framework. The iguana stands alone as a novelty of the New World. The iguana's behavior as a creature of both the land and water presents classification difficulties Oviedo confronts time and again in his efforts to describe it. Initially in the Sumario, he resolves this difficulty by categorizing the lizard among, quote, the vipers, snakes, serpents, lizards, toads, and other similar things. In the first edition of the Historia, Oviedo reconsiders this placement, ultimately deciding that the iguana is better suited to be an aquatic creature. Nevertheless, he is not entirely convinced by this choice. Expressing his hesitation, Oviedo claims that the true identity of the lizard is as yet unknown. He defines it as a, quote, neutral animal, since, quote, Christians do not know how to determine if it is a type of flesh or fish. At first glance, it is difficult to explain the bewilderment that Oviedo conveys in the Sumario and the Historia regarding the iguana's aquatic and terrestrial habits. It is true that the main authority Oviedo consults on natural history, Pliny the Elder, doesn't mention the iguana since the species is native to the New World. Nevertheless, the Roman historian does describe several animals that occupy distinct habitats. In addition to the crocodile, Pliny also describes a sea calf and a bramble frog, both which live equally in the water and on land. And while Isidore of Seville had already classified these kinds of creatures as amphibians, it appears that Oviedo still considered the iguana an anomaly. The root of Oviedo's perplexity and preoccupation with the iguana can be traced to its importance as a cuisine for Spanish colonists in the New World. The popularity of its meat brings to the fore a religious dilemma unanticipated by Oviedo's predecessors. Namely, should it be treated as flesh or fish on days of abstinence, as decreed by the Church? It is not until the subsequent edition of the first part of the Historia, published in 1547, that Oviedo explicitly addresses this issue. He decides against its classification as fish, including it instead among the terrestrial animals, accompanied with the categorical statement, quote, I consider it meat. I do not say this so that people stop following their own conscience, and principally what is ordered by the prelates and the Church. Oviedo's decades-long struggle in determining the true nature of the iguana is not a question of scientific interest, but rather spiritual concern. His attempts to resolve these queries embody the challenge that New World phenomena pose to different facets of life in ways unanticipated by his classical predecessors. It is no coincidence that Oviedo decides to include an illustration of the lizard in the 1535 edition of the Historia, a moment in which he has yet to find an answer for this dilemma. As with all the visual material in the work, he hopes the woodcut will allow readers to better understand this creature. Quote, this that I painted here wants to resemble the iguana, and truthfully, this is the form they have. However, although Oviedo invites readers to see the iguana, he emphasizes that this act does not necessarily provide any deeper knowledge of the iguana than what is available in its written description. He urges caution when contemplating its pictorial representation, again warning that, quote, this animal is neutral and men cannot determine whether it is of the land or the water. The queries that Oviedo has about the lizard are manifest in both mediums of communication. He is unable to get any closer to the truth by availing himself of visual form. The iguana is not the only species of fauna to confound Oviedo with its idiosyncrasies. The manatee's identity also blurs the distinctions between different categories of being, making it difficult to determine exactly what it is to an untrained observer. Just as Oviedo employs visual representation in his attempts to communicate the nature of the iguana, so too does he avail himself of this tool in this case as well. Unlike the iguana, which occupies an intermediate space between the water and the land, the manatee is clearly an aquatic creature. It is, however, equally as unknown to Oviedo's readers as the lizard. He relates, quote, "Neither Pliny spoke of them, nor did Albertus Magnus write of them, nor are there any in Spain. Nor have I ever heard of a man of the sea or land say that he had seen them, nor heard of them, but on these islands and mainland of Spain's Indies." Its habitat, as well as its enormous size, make it impossible to transport a complete specimen to Spain. Nevertheless, Oviedo reports that once the manatee's meat has been cured, it travels so well that in 1531 he was able to present it to Charles V's wife, the Empress Isabella of Portugal, in Avila. This partial glimpse of the manatee from afar, being experienced exclusively by the palate, creates not a little confusion among those who consume it. Oviedo lauds the manatee as one of the, quote, "best fish in the world." But at the same time, he cautions that, quote, "it is the one that most seems like meat, and seeing it cut, it resembles beef to such an extent that he who hasn't seen it whole or who didn't know, looking at a piece cut from it, would not be able to figure out if it was beef or veal. In fact, they would assume it was meat, and all the men in the world would be deceived in this way." The case of the manatee presents still further difficulties for Oviedo in his task to make understood a reality his readers will likely never experience for themselves. The old world's efforts to assimilate this new sphere of knowledge will always be incomplete, taking place at a distance and in deceptive forms, such as the bits and pieces of the manatee's flesh. Those who have seen the mammal in its natural environment will have little difficulty associating the meat they ingest, and which tastes of beef, with this large aquatic beast. Those who have not, however, will be utterly mystified. Although Oviedo does not refer directly to the illustration of the manatee in its written description, it is to be imagined that he decides to include it both to showcase its novelty and address these kinds of potential misunderstandings. Floating in the middle of the woodcut with its slender flippers flopping at its side, there is no room for doubt that the manatee is clearly a creature of the sea. The episodes of the iguana and the manatee encapsulate key moments in which New World nature eludes easy answers. Oviedo's response to such predicaments brings to the fore the importance he accords to illustration as a vehicle to make understood those phenomena at the very margins of known existence. In these pivotal encounters, he wields his artistic impulses strategically as an ultimate recourse to facilitate understanding. At the precipice of the unknown, Oviedo delineates what he knows carefully, ever cautious not to step over the edge. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Okay, so next we have our last presenter, Luisa Rollins Castillo, who is a PhD candidate in anthropology at the University of Illinois, Chicago. She is a co-organizer of the 2019 Island Anthropologies workshop with Dr. Kiran Jarayam in Santo Domingo. So take it away.
Hi all. Can you all hear me? Okay,
Yes.
Great. I just wanted to make sure my microphone was working. Hi. Let me. Would it be possible to share my screen? Let's see.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I just have a couple of pictures and a few quotations on here that might make it easier for people to follow along. Okay, so hi again, my name is Luisa Rollins Castillo. I'm a PhD candidate in the Anthropology department at the University of Illinois at Chicago, as Kirsten said. I'd like to first thank the conference organizers and my fellow panelists, especially Dr. Derby for including me in the panel, as well as the persons on whom this presentation is based. Today I'll share a section that I'm hoping to integrate into a broader discussion on the political economic implications and effective dimensions related to the work of environmental conservation or ecological labor, as has been termed by some scholars within the field of anthropology. Part of my work seeks to better understand the development and impact of so-called green economic initiatives to address environmental change and socioeconomic precarity in the Dominican Republic, following workers involved with various conservation initiatives in the province of Fernández in the Dominican Southwest. I've explored relatable aspects related to these efforts, focusing more specifically on reforestation and soil conservation, while remaining attentive to the larger network of projects within which these are located. I chose to conduct this research in what is commonly known as the Sud Profundo because of its particular context, both historical and contemporary. The province's perceived remoteness has undoubtedly shaped its development options and its treatment as a resource frontier, from logging and mining in the early to mid 1900s, moving towards developing different types of eco-friendly markets, such as ecotourism, while at the same time attracting an agro-export industry looking to benefit from, until recently, much less surveilled and unexploited landscapes and attendant water resources. So an examination of the local politics within which these various conservation initiatives come to be embedded says much about their potential to effect change on a larger scale. Reforestation Brigade member, for instance, commented that, aquí todo es política. Here, everything is politics, meaning that opportunities for participation in many of these projects is usually determined by one's standing in local and national party politics. Due to the clientelism prevalent in Dominican politics, projects usually run in accordance with the leanings of those who are in charge. At the very local level, these can be supervisors and technicians, or técnicos. This process is not only common, but also assumed and expected. Participation in leadership or supervisory role within a particular project is oftentimes predicated on prior involvement with similar projects. Now, for Rafaelito, on whose story I focus in this presentation, and other interlocutors in the field, integration into different conservation and ecological projects had been a result of their independently acquired familiarity and intimate knowledge of their local environment. I met Rafaelito in 2012 during one of my shorter summer field trips at a tourism development workshop led by the Ministry of Tourism, and specifically targeted towards youth in the area. So high school students, recent graduates, some university students, and other youth. It was through him that I found out about Pedernales Nature Guides Association, or AGINAPE, conformed mostly by young men and a few young women. Aside from this, from his involvement in the association, Rafaelito exemplified the precarious position in which the younger generation, those born around the time of the aluminum company of America's closure and dwindling agrarian livelihoods, found themselves in Pedernales. If not able to pay their way through university and dedicate their time to study, as well as to the 3-hour guagua it takes to get to Barahona, which is where the nearest university is located, many found themselves echando días, or taking part in the day laboring economy, either through working the land, construction, motoconcheando. I slowly figured out that Rafaelito was a jack of all trades and quite good at many of them, a sort of Renaissance man, with an autodidactic attitude and a deep knowledge about the area's ecology and related issues. In one of my interviews with Rafaelito, I began asking him about his work history. And this was part of the conversation where he had said that, and I'll read this in Spanish, I didn't translate it. En lo que concierne al trabajo, a yo buscar el dinero, yo vengo haciéndolo desde pequeño, desde que yo tenía más o menos 9 años. Lo primero que yo hice fue buscar camarones en el río para vender a los restaurantes de aquí, de Pedernales. Yo tenía la cultura de cazador desde pequeño, desde los 10, 12 años. Lo que sea que se mueva, si se movía, era bueno para cazarlo. Pero tú lo cazabas ¿con qué propósito? Para comer. Rafaelito had come to insert himself in ecological and conservation work by way of hunting and consuming the endemic iguana species found in this region of the island. He knew where to find them, and this was an asset when it came to work for Parques del Sur, a Dominican environmental organization focused on the conservation of the area's resources, and that also works on various projects focused on the protection and conservation of the different species of iguana in the region. These are for the Ricordi, or iguana ricord, and the rhinoceros iguana, or the Ciclura cornuta iguana. When I asked him where this practice of hunting iguanas had come from, his response was, mainly that they had learned it from older adults, and that they did it, him and the group of friends that he went to hunt with, did it in order to, as a hobby. Que lo hacíamos de hobby, salir a cazar para divertirnos y comer aves. Pero eso salía de las personas mayores ya. Entonces nosotros escuchábamos a ellos hablar de eso y también cazaban. Decían que las iguanas eran buenas, que los hurones son buenos, y nosotros lo hacíamos porque lo escuchábamos a ellos. Ahí no había concientización ambiental ni nada. Ahí lo que se movía se comía. Now, efforts to protect the endemic iguana populations in the region began in earnest in the early 2000s, with support from both Dominican and especially international organizations, such as the International Union for the Conservation of Nature and the International Iguana Foundation, that have generally provided the funds for these initiatives, as well as academic institutions and scholars, mostly in the biological sciences, who have devoted attention to studying the particularities of these different iguana species. These studies have found that various anthropogenic factors, namely habitat encroachment due to the expansion of the agricultural frontier in the area, population increase, and the resulting increase in introduced non-human animals, particularly dogs and cats, represent the greatest threats to endemic iguana survival in the region. Iguana hunting and poaching within this context is viewed as predatory behavior that ignores the ecological significance of the species, and those who engage in this activity, both Dominican and Haitian, are classified as predators, even when this is qualified by accounting for socioeconomic conditions that may lead to these practices. Iguanas, however, have been documented as an important part of the Taino diet, along with other marine animals and other small mammals endemic to the island, such as the jutia. Here I'd like to say, it's been great listening to all these presentations of Dr. Paravicini and Gansen, who were focused on Oviedo's work. He devoted, I believe, a whole chapter to iguanas, and this is something that, in trying to figure out how to frame this presentation and moving forward, I came across Dr. Paravicini's project translating the Oviedo's volumes, and so I'm very thankful to Dr. Derby for having included me, because it kind of pushed me in that direction. Now, the tension here lies in the fact that conservation work in this context relies heavily on these intimate knowledges that are acquired through modes of practice that are oftentimes considered predatory, and which may indeed be so within our contemporary understandings of these relationships. Yet this knowledge is essential within a continuum of ecological knowledge required to attend to these issues, as demonstrated through Rafaelito's story. So in explaining how, sorry about that. I'll just read it. Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I'm sorry. So in explaining how he became involved in these conservation projects, Rafaelito recounted, a Darío, who was involved with the guides organization, le llegó una visita de unas personas que querían hacer monitoreo de iguanas y necesitaban a alguien del grupo de guías que pueda guiarlos en los montes que haya iguanas. Para ese entonces, el grupo era reciente todavía. Entonces no tenían ellos a un miembro del grupo que supiera andar en el monte, porque yo sabía del monte, pero era porque yo era el cazador. Darío me recomendó a mí, diciendo, la persona más indicada aquí para andar en el monte es Rafaelito, porque él cazaba iguanas y cazaba aves y sabe todos esos montes por ahí. Y yo en realidad sabía donde quiera que había una iguana en los montes. Yo me les sabía las casas a todas porque estaba acechándolas para cazarlas. And this I want to kind of bring back, listening to Kirsten's discussion also of the ways in which different scientists engage with fishermen in her field site. That while the fishermen are considered predators in some regard, they have this other type of knowledge that they would be able to contribute to this continuum that I'm trying to analyze. And missing from this conversation about contemporary conditions of endangered species, specifically of the endemic iguana habitats, is a political, economic, and ecological analysis of state incursion into these areas through the various extractive developmental projects, including enforced agricultural production, mining, tourism. Tourism development in these spaces would obviously not bode well for the local iguana populations, but it is precisely the mode of development that has been encouraged and demanded for decades. These gaps in logic distort these ecological relationships between human and non-human animals in these contexts. Lastly, I just wanted to say that on a more practical level, I was at the panel earlier today where they were discussing the importance of these transborder ecosystems. Thinking about environmental education on the island, a historical approach that accounts for changing ecological relationships and that historicizes these relationships and as well doesn't shy away from the politics of environmental change might prove useful to move these issues forward. Thank you very much. And I hope to engage with folks here.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That was great. Yes, I think there are some really interesting overlaps between all of these presentations. So what I want to do now is open it up to questions. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask any questions to any or all participants, or you could write your questions in the chat as well.
Kirsten, I have a question for you, actually. I'm not sure I heard you correctly, but I think that you said something about the fishermen think that, or sort of attribute to the fish the ability to read and write.
Yes.
Could you elaborate on that? I like the sort of logic of getting to that point.
Well, in the context in which I heard that comment, it was after conservation laws had made parrotfish illegal to catch. And so the kind of joking logic that they had made there was that parrotfish had read the law that said that they were now under protection. But in reality, it locates fish and fishermen intelligence in particular ways. And it kind of plays with this fact that fishermen really don't have access to good education. And many of them are semi-literate. And so saying that fish know how to read and write kind of places them in this like hierarchical education system of knowledge in relation to fishermen.
Thank you.
I had a comment for Elizabeth. It will just in general, this is a really fascinating panel and I really loved all the presentations. But Elizabeth, I was wondering about whether you've taken a look at like Mary Douglas's work or some of that early, British anthropology that's thinking about animal classification, because I found it helpful. And it just seems like, Mary Douglas is just speaking to your project.
No, I haven't. I wrote her name down. Thank you. I will look into that. I'm sorry, I can't turn on my video for some reason, but that's just an aside. But yeah, thank you for that recommendation.
Oh,
Yeah, I guess unless if there's a question, I just had a comment, but I can leave that until after.
Oh, I thought we were 145. Is that wrong?
I'm not sure when it ends, but I mean, Bill.
Okay.
Okay.
Go ahead, Luisa.
No, it was just a comment with regards to your discussion about your interlocutors thinking you were part of the CIA. If these were, that question came up a couple of times when I was doing field work as well. I think more so in a joking manner, because this is probably something that's brought up often with regards to researchers. It was interesting though, because recently with the new change in government, the person who was appointed to the Dominican consulate or office in Ansapit near Fernández, their last name is the same as my last name, and so I received messages from people there asking me about that, and it has become this thing where I'm trying to figure out how to handle that, because I have no idea who this person is. But yeah, I can relate to that, to those feelings. So it's just a comment.
Yeah, it's an interesting position to be in when you're trying to navigate research relations and then also convince people that you don't have political stakes.
I have a comment. Can I make a comment? I haven't read as much of the colonial documents as I should. I'm working on it, but I'm not quite there yet. But I will say that I'm teaching a graduate seminar on animals this quarter, and we just read Leon Garcia Garagasa's piece, "The Year That the People Turned into Cattle," which is an account. It's a kind of millenarian account of the end of the world, and from colonial Mexico. And the thing that really struck me is that I had never really thought about before is, his account in this deploying this millenarian document. He's trying to reorder the society through reinstantiating all the food taboos that were a very important part of indigenous cosmology. And I'm just struck by the kind of the contrast between the Spanish, who ate everything willy-nilly, no rules, just like eat it all, and they ate their way across and exterminated all these species, compared to this incredible grammar of very detailed food taboos. And you have certain groups are called the people who eat leftovers, and there's this like incredibly complex rules around eating, and then the Spanish, who are savages. And it just really, I never really thought about this before, but it strikes me very that this is something that's just very apparent in the colonial documentation that.
Hi, sorry. Yes, so this is exactly what I was thinking about while you guys were talking about kind of the observation and the way that the observation was made about animals. And even indigenous people, and this kind of idea that it's all coming from this lens of consumption, and like, you know, the way that the animals are described, the way that the people are described, the way that the land is described, and how that ties into like modern agricultural practices. And it kind of just dawned on me the idea that like food and eating is so important for like colonialism. I'm like, wait a minute, this is really all about eating. Like what? But yeah, so I'm thinking about how all of this connects to like our modern agricultural practices, like how those colonial like observations of the new world have led to like where we are now, in terms of how we eat and how we produce animals and food and meat and all of that.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I definitely kind of see that happening on the level of like what kinds of fish local people eat, and then what kinds of fish they are encouraged to fish for so that they can export them either to the big cities or tourist areas or abroad. So I think that's a really interesting point, because you see people on the coast, rural families who are eating small fish because they taste better. But then there are these really big conservation campaigns that are saying like, we need to make the size of the nets bigger so that small fish don't get caught, because then the babies are not able to reproduce, etc. So yeah, I think you're right. Consumption is definitely a theme, and at multiple scales and at multiple points in the history of the Dominican Republic.
If I could venture an observation, I also think that, you know, in terms of the grammar of, you know, Dominican foodways have a very strong grammar to them. And I think that Dominican culture seems to me, I've long observed that Dominicans identify via the foods they eat and they don't eat in an important way, which might locate them more on the Taino side of things than the barbarian Spanish side of things. It's just an interesting observation, because also, you know, when we think of Taino traces, I mean, food, stuffs, namings of food products, and also food technologies are one of the most important sources of Taino residues. And so, I don't know, food for thought.
Robin, I had a really quick question for you. You had mentioned that dogging was something that was termed in relation to colonial and Amerindian contact. And I was wondering if you knew what the Spanish translation for that was.
I have to defer to Lisa Barbazzini, because I mean, perrear, I'm not sure.
Yes, perrear, that's what they use for the dance, right? It's
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
Perreo.
perreo, right?
Is that what the translation is?
Yeah, I think so.
Well, you know, I picked that up from a classic text called The Dogs of Conquest. So I would refer back to that if I could get to a library, but you know, that's not happening anytime soon. But when the time comes, I will get that book and check it out.
I mean, it's interesting because it has entered the whole world of dance hall, right?
Yeah.
And where the verb is perrear, so I don't know, we may adapt it, you know, confluence of different moments in which dogs become, and dogging becomes important.
That's fascinating.
Sort of relating Yennefer's comment on how a lot of species, when they're described in colonial texts, it's all based on consumption. And this idea of dogs, something that I find really entertaining in Oviedo is not just all of the foods that he tries, that the indigenous people like the Taino try, but the foods that he can't really figure out because the Taino eat them, but he's not impressed by them. You know, they don't have like the flavor that would justify them being cultivated. So there must be some other reason why, you know, the Taino grow them or raise them. And Lisa, there's an episode, you probably know it, but in the anecdote of the dogs, where Oviedo tries dog, but he doesn't know what he's eating.
Yes.
So delicious, and they sort of tell him halfway through what it is. Man, I really wish that they hadn't told me right then. I kept eating it, but I really wish I would have just known after.
So one of the things, the reasons one loves Oviedo, right?
Kirsten, I had another question for you, because you talked about the fishermen sort of encountering two different difficulties or obstacles, the lack or the diminishing of fish, and then also the protections of fish. And so I'm wondering, have they come up with ways to continue fishing, like any creative ways to combat those situations?
Yes, kind of unfortunately, because their ways of doing that are either to use the compressor system, which pumps air from like a paint air compressor, one that you would use to like paint a house, pumps air down to divers below, and then they kind of run the risk of getting the bends or decompression sickness as they're diving deeper and deeper to find these depleted fish populations. But the other means of reaching kind of beyond the nearshore waters of Monte Cristi are illegal trips into Bahamian or Turks and Caicos waters on these really small outboard motored boats, which have in the past 2 years just exploded and are like illegally sanctioned by the state in some ways through these kinds of clientelism networks, but they often get caught and serve jail time in the Bahamas or in Turks and Caicos. So the solutions are not good solutions, to answer your question.
I have another question regarding that situation. Are the fishermen, because it seems to me like the sanctions that are being posed on the fishermen are not necessarily addressing the issue that are diminishing the amount of fish, which is in pollution and contamination and all of these things. Like fishing alone is not the problem, or it doesn't seem like the main problem. Are the fishermen like aware of that, and is that being articulated in that kind of in this discussion, like in the political discussion? Like, is that, you know, is somebody saying like, this is not the right solution? It seems like you guys are kind of scapegoating the problem.
Yeah, they're definitely vocalizing that. They're 100% saying things like that. But the problem largely has been that what they're saying is never taken into consideration in terms of the broader kinds of conservation discussions that are happening, not only at the national level, but even at the regional level. And also, it's so easy to blame fishermen for overfishing because they are not necessarily in tune with the kinds of feedback loops that would allow them to change the narrative or speak back. So yeah, I think it's an easy thing. It's harder to say, oh, we need to stop using pesticides on rice in the Cibao region because there's so much money involved in that and so much political clout. I think we're about at the end of our time. So I want to thank all of you for being here, and thank you so much to the panelists. These were fascinating papers, and I hope that we can continue to have conversations about them and with each other. So thank you, Robin, again for organizing, and thank you, Luisa and Elizabeth.